I never expected to see him again. Not after all these years, not after I had built a life so far removed from who I used to be. But there he was, standing in the coffee shop on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, his hair a little grayer, his eyes still holding that same spark that once made my teenage heart race. I was supposed to be running errands. Just another mundane day in my predictable suburban life. My husband, David, was at work like always. Our marriage had settled into a comfortable routine: morning coffee, small talk about the news, dinner at the same time every night. We were happy, I told myself. Or at least content. Then I saw him. Mark Reynolds, my high school sweetheart, the boy who once made me feel like the center of the universe. The one who wrote me love notes and kissed me behind the bleachers after football games. The one I let go when life pulled us in different directions. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to turn around and walk away. But before I could decide, his gaze met mine, and recognition flickered across his face. His smile was instant, genuine, and suddenly I was 17 again. He called my name with that same warmth I remembered, and I forced a laugh, trying to mask the rush of emotions crashing over me. He was visiting his mother, he told me, still in the same house. He asked about me, and I told him the truth. I had never left, I had a family now, a life rooted in the past we once shared. His expression softened, but there was something unreadable in his eyes.
By the way, if you're curious about what happened next, subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Thank you.
He admitted he had always wondered what happened to me, and in that moment, I realized I had wondered about him too, more times than I cared to admit. When he motioned toward an empty table, I should have said no. I should have made an excuse, smiled politely, and walked out the door. But I didn't. Instead, I sat down, letting nostalgia wrap around me like a warm embrace, completely unaware of the consequences that one simple decision would bring. Seeing Mark again was like reopening a book I thought I had long since finished. We sat at that coffee shop for what felt like hours, reminiscing about our youth, filling in the blanks of the years that had passed. He had moved to the city, built a career, married and divorced. No children. I listened intently, feeling a pang of something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Curiosity? My own life, in contrast, felt mapped out, predictable. The husband, the house, the children, the daily routine that never truly changed. But Mark had lived. As we talked, I caught myself laughing in a way I hadn't in years. He had the same charm, the same way of making the world feel like it was spinning just for him. I envied that. I envied the way his life seemed to have chapters while mine felt like a single page stuck on repeat. He leaned in at one point, his voice dropping slightly, and told me I hadn't changed. That same girl he once knew was still there, just buried under the weight of time. I wanted to protest, to tell him he was wrong. But was he? When I finally glanced at my phone, I realized how late it had gotten. David would be home soon, expecting dinner on the table like always. Guilt crept in, wrapping around me like a cold chain. I stood quickly, fumbling for an excuse, saying something about needing to go. Mark didn't press. He just smiled, slid a napkin across the table with a number written on it, and told me he'd love to catch up again. I stared at the numbers, then at him. My fingers curled around the napkin as I turned to leave, knowing full well that I had already made a decision before even stepping out the door. I tried to push the meeting with Mark to the back of my mind, but it lingered like a song stuck on repeat. The next few days felt different, slightly unsteady, as if a new possibility had been introduced into my carefully structured life. I moved through my daily routine, morning coffee with David, errands, housework, checking in on the kids, yet every mundane task was now underscored by the thought of him. The napkin with his number was still tucked away in my purse, untouched, but I knew it was only a matter of time. One afternoon, while David was still at work and the kids were preoccupied, I found myself reaching for my phone before I could think better of it. I hesitated, staring at the number. It would be so easy to just text him, to slip back into something familiar and exciting. My fingers hovered over the screen before finally typing out a short, harmless message. It was great seeing you. Hope you're doing well. Seconds passed, then minutes. Just as I began to regret sending it, my phone vibrated. I was hoping you'd text. I haven't stopped thinking about our conversation. How about a coffee this week? No pressure, just two old friends catching up. No pressure. I repeated those words in my head, knowing full well that it wasn't true. This wasn't just two old friends catching up. This was something else, something unspoken but powerful, something that had the potential to change everything. But before I could talk myself out of it, I typed back, "I'd like that." The moment I hit send, my heart pounded in a way it hadn't in years. Something was beginning, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. The day of our coffee meeting arrived faster than I expected. I told myself it was nothing, a simple catch-up between two people who once meant something to each other. But as I got dressed, I found myself paying more attention to the details. A touch of mascara, a spritz of perfume I hadn't worn in years, a blouse that flattered my figure just right. It was just coffee, I reminded myself, nothing more. I arrived at the small cafe on the edge of town a few minutes early, my nerves buzzing under my skin. Mark was already there, sitting by the window with 2 cups on the table. He looked up, and when our eyes met, his face broke into that easy, familiar smile. A smile that made my stomach tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I got you a cappuccino," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "I remembered you used to love them." I smiled, touched by the simple gesture. "You remembered, right?" The conversation flowed effortlessly, like no time had passed at all. We talked about our lives, our families, the things we wished we had done differently. I told him about David, about the stability and predictability of my marriage. He listened, nodding, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of his cup. When he spoke about his life, there was a hint of something in his voice, loneliness, perhaps, or longing. At some point, his hand brushed against mine, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through my body. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman. When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car. There was a hesitation in his stance, as if he was debating whether to say something more. Finally, he exhaled and smiled. "I'm glad we did this." I nodded, gripping my keys a little too tightly. "Me too." I got into the car, my heart pounding as I watched him disappear into the cafe. As I drove home, I realized that I had crossed an invisible line, and there was no turning back now. That night, I lay in bed next to David, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. His breathing was steady, deep in sleep, completely unaware of the turmoil inside me. I turned on my side, watching the shadows stretch across the room, feeling an unfamiliar restlessness settle in my chest. The memory of Mark's touch, the way he looked at me like I was someone worth noticing, played over and over in my mind. The next day, I went through the motions, preparing breakfast, making small talk with David, tending to errands, but I was distracted. My phone sat heavy in my pocket, Mark's number just a few taps away. I told myself I wouldn't text him, that what happened at the cafe was a momentary lapse, but the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. By mid-afternoon, I gave in. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed. "I keep thinking about our conversation. Would love to see you again." The response came almost instantly. "I was hoping you'd say that. How about tomorrow? Same place?" My heart pounded. I hesitated for only a second before replying, "Yes." That night, I found myself more aware of David than ever before. How he reached for my hand at dinner, how he asked about my day, how comfortable we had become in our routine. Guilt gnawed at me, but it wasn't enough to stop what was already in motion. The next day, I stood outside the cafe again, anticipation thrumming through me. Mark was already there, waiting, and when he saw me, that same knowing smile spread across his face. As I stepped inside, I felt a shift deep within me. I wasn't just here for coffee. I was here for something more, something I couldn't name but desperately needed. And I knew I wasn't going to stop. Sitting across from Mark again, I felt a sense of exhilaration that both thrilled and terrified me. The way he looked at me, as if I were someone new, someone untethered from the life I had built, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. We talked, but this time it wasn't just catching up. It was something deeper, something unspoken that hummed between us like an electric current. He asked about my life, and I gave him the version I had repeated for years. Stable, predictable, good. But as I spoke, the words felt hollow. Did I really believe them? Or was I just trying to convince myself? He didn't push, but his eyes told me he saw through the facade. At one point, he reached across the table, his fingers barely grazing mine, and I didn't pull away. The touch sent a shiver up my spine, a reminder of something I thought was long gone. "You deserve to be happy, Julie," he said, his voice low, intimate. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "I am happy," I whispered, but even I didn't believe it. We left the cafe together, stepping out into the late afternoon sun. The world felt different, heavier. I knew I should go home, back to David, back to the life I had built, but my feet hesitated. Mark studied me for a moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out his car keys. "Come with me," he said softly. It wasn't a demand, just an invitation, a choice. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the moment stretch between us, the weight of it settling deep in my chest. Then, almost without thinking, I took a step closer, and I knew I had already made my decision. The drive was quiet, the tension between us thick enough to feel. Mark's hands gripped the wheel, his knuckles tight, but he didn't speak. I stared out the window, my pulse racing, knowing that whatever was about to happen would change everything. The city streets blurred past us, fading into the open road, the hum of the tires against the pavement the only sound between us. I could feel his glances, his silent questions, but I had no answers, not yet. We pulled up to a small lake outside town, the water still, reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. He killed the engine and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Julie, we don't have to do anything you don't want to do." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I know." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The air between us crackled, heavy with years of unspoken feelings, of paths not taken. He reached for my hand again, and this time I didn't hesitate. His fingers curled around mine, warm, steady, grounding. "Tell me to take you home, and I will," he murmured. But that wasn't what I wanted. I wasn't ready to return to the life I had convinced myself was enough. Not yet. Instead of answering, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. His breath hitched as my lips brushed his, hesitant at first, then surer, deeper. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and in that moment everything else faded, the guilt, the doubt, the consequences. All that mattered was the fire rekindling inside me, the part of me I had forgotten still existed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew there was no turning back. And for the first time in years, I didn't care. The drive back was different. Silence hung between us, but it wasn't the tense, uncertain quiet from before. This was heavier, weighted with the reality of what had just happened. Mark's hand rested on the gear shift, fingers flexing slightly, as if resisting the urge to reach for mine again. I stared out the window, my reflection ghostly in the glass, my mind a tangled mess of emotions. As we neared the outskirts of town, the familiarity of my life began to creep back in. The streetlights, the neat rows of houses, the sense of order that had once brought me comfort. I should have felt guilty, should have been panicked over what I had done. But all I felt was the lingering warmth of Mark's touch and the hollow space inside me that had finally been filled, if only for a moment. He pulled into a quiet side street a few blocks from my house. Neither of us spoke right away. He turned to me, his eyes searching, waiting for some kind of confirmation that this wasn't just a mistake. "Julie," he said, his voice low, measured, "I don't want to make things harder for you, but I also don't want this to be the last time." I looked at him, at the man who had suddenly become both my escape and my undoing. I should have said no. I should have ended it right there. But instead, I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his. "I don't either." His jaw tightened slightly, as if he had been bracing for another answer. He exhaled, nodding, a silent understanding passing between us. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady as I made my way home. The house was dark, quiet. David would already be asleep, unaware of how different his wife had become in just one evening. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. Then, as if nothing had changed, I slipped inside and shut the door behind me, knowing that everything had. The days that followed were a blur of routine and distraction. I went through the motions of my life, morning coffee with David, conversations with the kids, errands, chores, but everything felt distant, as if I were moving through a dream. My body was here, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the moments with Mark, the warmth of his touch, the weight of his gaze. I told myself I wouldn't text him, that I needed to step back before I did something I couldn't undo. But each time I reached for my phone, my resolve weakened. The line had already been crossed, and deep down, I knew I didn't want to step back. I wanted more. Late one evening, after David had gone to bed, I finally gave in. My fingers trembled as I typed out a message. "I can't stop thinking about you." His response came quickly. "Then don't, let's see each other tomorrow." A rush of anticipation coursed through me, drowning out the whisper of guilt that had been lingering in the back of my mind. Okay. The next afternoon, I found myself standing outside a small motel on the edge of town. The air was thick with tension, my heart pounding as I watched Mark's car pull into the lot. He stepped out, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked toward me, his expression unreadable, his presence pulling me in like a force I couldn't resist. Without a word, he reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and led me inside. The door shut behind us, and in that instant, the last shred of restraint I had left disappeared. There was no turning back now. The hours that followed felt like a dream, a haze of sensations and emotions that blurred together. the weight of Mark's hands, the way he whispered my name, the feeling of surrendering completely to a part of myself I had long buried. Time stood still in that motel room, the outside world fading into insignificance. But as the sun began to set, reality crept back in. I lay beside him, my body still tangled in his, my mind beginning to stir with thoughts I had tried to push away. I had done it. I had crossed the line, shattered the illusion of the life I had built. There was no erasing what had happened, no undoing it. Mark ran his fingers lightly down my arm, as if sensing the shift in my thoughts. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, filled with something that almost resembled concern. I hesitated, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know." He didn't push. He just lay there, silent, waiting for me to process the weight of my choices. Eventually, I forced myself to sit up, reaching for my clothes. "I should go," I murmured, though part of me didn't want to. Mark propped himself up on one elbow, watching me with an unreadable expression. "Julie, this doesn't have to be the last time." My fingers stilled on the buttons of my blouse. That was the problem, wasn't it? I had always known that once I gave in, it wouldn't be just once. It would never be enough. I turned to him, searching his face, but he didn't need to say anything else. We both knew I had already made my decision long before I walked into that room. I left without saying another word, slipping into the cool evening air, my heart pounding. As I drove home, the guilt began to settle in, but beneath it, hidden deep where I wouldn't have to acknowledge it, was something far more dangerous. Desire. The following days were a balancing act between normalcy and deception. I moved through my routine as if nothing had changed. Morning coffee with David, school runs, dinner preparations. Yet beneath it all, a storm was brewing inside me. The memory of Mark lingered in my thoughts, his touch still imprinted on my skin, his voice echoing in my mind at the most unexpected moments. I told myself it had been a mistake, a reckless moment of weakness that would never happen again. But the lie tasted bitter, even as I forced myself to believe it. My hands trembled when I folded laundry. My pulse quickened whenever my phone buzzed, half hoping and half dreading that it was him. It was late one evening when the temptation became too much. David had fallen asleep on the couch, the TV humming softly in the background. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, my thumb hovering over Mark's name in my messages. I knew I shouldn't, but the weight of my desires crushed my better judgment. "I need to see you," I finally typed, my breath catching as I hit send. The reply was almost immediate, "Come over." My heart pounded as I slipped out the front door, the cool night air biting against my skin. I told myself I was just going for a drive, but deep down, I knew exactly where I was going. Mark's place was across town, a small apartment nestled in a quiet complex. When I knocked, he opened the door almost instantly, as if he had been waiting. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I stepped inside, and as soon as the door clicked shut behind me, I was lost to him again. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was dangerous. That each time I gave in, the harder it would be to stop. But in that moment, wrapped in the heat of his embrace, I didn't care. I wasn't ready to stop. The weight of my choices settled on me like an unbearable burden. Days blurred into nights, and yet I kept finding my way back to Mark. Each stolen moment was a mix of passion and dread, a cycle that became harder to break. But the walls were closing in. David started to notice my distance, the way I avoided his gaze, the late-night drives that had no real explanation. One evening, as I stepped through the front door, I found him waiting. His eyes searched mine, weary and full of something I couldn't ignore. "Julie, what's going on?" His voice was quiet, but the weight of his suspicion was deafening. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had rehearsed excuses, imagined ways to cover my tracks, but standing in front of him now, I realized there was no more running. My betrayal had left a crack in our life together, one that was growing wider with every lie. The words caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to confess and beg for some impossible forgiveness, but fear swallowed me whole. He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "You're not here anymore, Julie. Even when you are, I just need to know if there's someone else." My silence was an answer in itself. The room grew unbearably quiet. The truth had finally seeped through, and I saw something shift in his expression, something breaking. "I don't know if I can fix this," he murmured finally, stepping back, "but I needed to know." Tears burned at my eyes as I watched him walk away, leaving me standing alone in the life I had built and shattered all at once. Mark had been an escape, a way to feel something I thought I had lost. But now, staring at the wreckage of my marriage, I realized too late that I had never really been ready to lose it at all.
Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.